from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Also, thanks to my friend, Mr. Garrett from Virginia, for organizing this in support of those protesters in Iran. And it's the ongoing protests that started late last month in Iran that are significant, not just for their people, but also for the world. And while these protests started because of a dire economic situation in Iran, with upwards of 40% of its youth unemployed, it's grown to be a nationwide movement that is about much more than just the economy. Over the past couple of weeks, we've seen the Iranian people flood the streets in favor of fundamental freedoms, economic opportunity, and a government who represents their interest, not Hezbollah's. There are even reports of people chanting, "We don't want an Islamic Republic," or "We will die, but we will take Iran back." And this is a long time coming. A State Department report in 2016 found that Iran is the top state sponsor of terrorism in the whole world. Whether it's providing financial support to Hezbollah or providing arms to Islamic rebel groups in Yemen, the Iranian government's priorities are obviously more focused on wreaking international havoc than they are in addressing the pressing issues within their own country. And while we're talking about issues with Iran, the protesters are pleading for fundamental freedoms. For example, married women aren't even allowed to travel outside the country without permission from their husbands. They also risk being put in jail or even to death if they take off their hijab in public. But brave women throughout Iran have been unmasking themselves during the last couple of weeks in protest, and to many in our country this may seem insignificant. But videos of these women and their courage have been shared millions and millions of times around the globe. Mr. Speaker, those who dislike President Trump have criticized his approach to foreign policy, but these same people fail to praise his strong defense for freedom when it comes to Iran. As soon as the protests started, President Trump put out a statement that said the Iranian people are hungry for food and for freedom. He also said that it's time for a change, and I couldn't agree with him more. This is opposite of the Obama administration, who preached moral authority and yet sided with the corrupt Iranian regime and the corrupt Iranian government when anti-regime protesters took to the streets back in 2009. So now that President Trump has proven his credibility on the global stage by siding with the protesters, the question is now, where do we go from here? Well, Mr. Speaker, first, we should increase the sanctions on the Iranian government in response to their crackdown on protesters for freedom in the recent weeks. President Trump should also strongly consider pulling out of the nuclear deal that was struck by President Obama in 2015. We've already seen the Iranian government break parts of the agreement, and we should have a zero tolerance for these breaks because the consequences are just too grave. Mr. Speaker, the people of Iran are bravely speaking out against their government, and they're calling for change. For the United States to continue to be a shining example of freedom and liberty, we must continue to vocalize our support for these protesters in Iran and make sure that they know that we have their back. Again, I thank my colleague, Mr. Garrett from Virginia, and I yield back my time.
Thank you to my colleague from North Carolina, Mr. Budd. Mr. Speaker, at this time, I would recognize the gentleman from South Carolina.